Well, hey guys, we are ready to get back in our social studies books today after finishing the benchmark last week. And so get your social studies book and open it to page 142. Everybody open it to 142 so we can read together today. As we get into this new chapter, chapter 14 in our social studies book, we just finished up. We talked about a lot of things in that last unit with the war with Mexico for Texas and all that land out west, to manifest destiny, our land now going all the way to the Pacific Ocean. We talked about the Oregon Trail, the different trails that people would go out to use to go out west, the gold rush in California. And we kind of finished before we started doing benchmark reviews talking about slavery. And we were introduced to this word abolitionist. And that was somebody who wanted to end slavery. We really only talked about one major abolitionist, and that was William Lloyd Garrison, who had a newspaper called The Liberator in what we read before benchmark week. And so we're going to get in today some of the most famous abolitionists during this time period, some of the most famous people who tried to stop the horrible event that was happening in our country called slavery. And we know a little bit about how bad it was to be a slave. You had no freedom. You were not allowed to read. You would be whipped probably every week to make sure you followed the rules. It was just terrible work from sun up to sundown. A lot of people died. A lot of slaves died just from the life being so hard. And so these abolitionists want to end slavery. Some of the ones we're going to read about are white people who think slavery is terrible and they want slavery to end. Some of them are former slaves who either paid their way to be free or they've escaped and now they're a free slave trying to teach people about how terrible slavery was. But all the ones we're going to read about were abolitionists. They wanted slavery to end. So let's start reading here on page 142. And what we see in this title of this chapter is called A Growing Divide. That divide is between the North and the South. The northern states, they've outlawed slavery. They don't want slaves. They think it's wrong. The southern states, remember, think back to the Industrial Revolution. Most of the northern states were where the factories were, those textile mills, all those inventions we learned about in the Industrial Revolution. Those are up north where the factories are. The South is still mainly big plantations, big farms where all the slaves work. So there's a big difference in how people live in the North and the South. People in the North live in big cities, work in factories. A lot of the planters in the South have these slaves. They make their money with the big plantations and slave labor. So this divide between the North and the South begins to become a big part of what's going to happen in our country that we're going to read about in the 1860s, the Civil War. And this time we're reading about right now is the time before the war. It's called the antebellum period. We'll look at that in just a minute. Some questions we're going to answer today. How did Northern abolitionists work to end slavery? Remember, abolitionist is the word for those people who wanted to end slavery. They comes from the root word abolish, or to stop or end. How did the North and South become divided over the issue of slavery? And here's some of the people we'll be learning about and some of the words we'll be talking about. So page 142, let's read. The years before the Civil War are called the antebellum period. Antebellum is a Latin word meaning before the war. The antebellum period was a successful one for much of the nation, particularly for parts of the South. Railroads made it easier to sell products across the country. Many Southern families became very wealthy. As the number of farms and plantations grew, the number of slaves living there also grew. So remember, we talked about this already. Those inventions of the Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin, made it easier to pick the seeds out of cotton, to produce more cotton, to sell more cotton to the factories in the North that were turning it into cloth. And now we've got the railroads from this Industrial Revolution, so you can ship it much quicker on the railroad tracks. So you're getting lots of cotton shipped up north to the factories, shipped all over the world from the South. And so those people growing cotton in the South are getting very, very wealthy. And of course, they're getting their money on the back of the works of the slaves there. So we've got the question of slavery. In the early 1800s, new territories and states were added to the country. As each new state was added, settlers there had to answer an important question. They had to decide if their state would allow slavery. Throughout the country, people disagreed about slavery. More and more people in the North wanted it to end. They thought it was wrong. By 1804, all of the northern states had passed laws ending slavery. Also, the slave trade from Africa had ended. So you've got people in the North who are trying to end slavery, the northern states, but you got to remember people in the South depending on slavery. They'd stopped trading, bringing in slaves from Africa, thank goodness. Many Americans thought that these changes would help bring an end to slavery throughout the nation. But instead, a deep divide separated the slave states of the South from the free states of the North. By the 1850s, the nation was beginning to come apart. And so here we have a picture of some slaves working on a plantation and the abolition movement. The movement to abolish slavery grew rapidly in the 1840s. A white Northern man named William Lloyd Garrison became one of the most famous abolitionists through his newspaper, The Liberator. He also helped form the American Anti-Slavery Society. Sarah and Angelina Grimkey, two sisters from a wealthy Southern family, traveled the country speaking in support of abolitionism and women's rights. We're going to read some more about them later, but these two girls, these were sisters, and they grew up on a plantation that their dad owned, and they saw how bad the slaves were treated. They saw the slaves get beat and whipped, and it just tore them up. They thought it was terrible. So even though they grew up on a plantation, they left it and went and traveled around the country talking about how bad slaves were treated. An African-American woman and a former slave from New York State, Sojourner Truth, became famous for her speeches as well. She also spoke about women's rights. So you see, women's rights are becoming an issue here too. Women. We're going to listen, at the end of this lesson, I want you to listen to an actress portraying Sojourner Truth in her famous speech called Ain't I a Woman? Ain't I a Woman? You'll enjoy her speech. We're going to look a little bit at it. Look at a little bit of her speech on the next page. Frederick Douglass escaped slavery in Maryland and became a celebrated author and speaker. He wrote a book about his time enslaved that gained national attention. He also started an abolitionist newspaper for African Americans called the North Star. We'll find out about him later too. He also got to visit the White House when Abraham Lincoln was president and talk to Abraham Lincoln about slavery. In general, though, most white Southerners stood strongly against abolitionism. That means they did not want slavery to end. Southern crops like cotton, rice, and tobacco required large amounts of labor. Southern landowners knew their economy would crumble. Remember, when we see the word economy, we think money would crumble without the free labor slavery provided. Most Southerners would not even consider ending slavery. So look at how much slavery grew in 70 years, from 1790 to 1860, 1790. There were 654,121 slaves in the United States. 1860, there's 3,950,511. So it went up by over 3 million slaves in just 70 years. That's a lot of slaves. Look at this illustration here. Am I not a man and a brother? So you see this guy here, and he's a slave, obviously, and someone's drawing an illustration saying, am I not a man like you? Am I not a brother like you? This illustration appears on the abolitionist buttons in England in the 1780s. The banner below the enslaved man reads, am I not a man and a brother? What does that man appear to be doing? Kind of begging, isn't he? He's kind of down on his knees, begging somebody to maybe set him free. He's got chains on his wrist. All right, so Sojourner Truth, she's the one that did the Ain't I a Woman speech. So let's read a little bit about it. By the way, this is her right here. You see her picture here on page 145. This speech, called Ain't I a Woman, was given at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851. The speaker was Sojourner Truth, an abolitionist who fought also for equal rights between men and women. Read her words and answer the questions below. That man over there says that women need to be helped in the carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody helps me in the carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I've plowed and planted. I've gathered in the barns, and no man could head me. That means nobody could do more than she could. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? What do you think it means to bear the lash? It means to get whipped by those slave masters. And ain't I a woman? I have borne children. That means she's had kids. And seen most all of them sold off into slavery. So she had kids and her kids got sold away from her then. Wouldn't that be sad? And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? And maybe the most famous line in her speech, if the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they's asking to do it, and the men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. So that's her speech there. So she's speaking not only for slavery, against slavery rather, but she's speaking for women's rights, trying to say women ought to get the same rights as men. Here's those Grimkey sisters on page 145 that we were talking about that grew up on a plantation. Let's read about them. Sarah and Angelina Grimkey were born into a rich planter family in South Carolina. They grew up in Charleston. As children, they saw how enslaved people were treated. Sarah wanted to help them. It was against the law to teach enslaved humans how to read, but Sarah did it anyway. When Sarah and Angelina grew older, they felt strongly that slavery was wrong. Their father did not agree. The sisters moved to the North to join other abolitionists. They wrote about the evils of slavery in newspapers and booklets. They described what they had seen in South Carolina. After that, they were not welcome back in the state. Now, can you imagine getting kicked out of your state? The sisters built new lives in the North, and they continued to work for the rights of black people and women. And let's read about Sojourner. Ain't I a woman, lady? Sojourner Truth worked for an end to slavery as well as equality between men and women. Truth is born into slavery. Originally, her name was Isabella Baumfree. She often faced harsh punishments, such as whippings. She had 5 children who were also made to work as slaves. In 1827, she ran away with her youngest child. She found an abolitionist family who helped buy her freedom. Baumfree changed her name to Sojourner Truth and began preaching around New York. She also worked to help the poor. Eventually, she met abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. They encouraged her to share her story. Though she never learned to read or write, she gave speeches to large crowds. She spoke about freedom for African Americans. She also gave speeches on women's rights. Later, Truth moved to Michigan. She helped enslaved people escape to freedom in Canada. During the Civil War, President Lincoln invited her to speak at the White House. After the war, she continued to work for African American rights until her death. All right. Let's turn to page 146 now. And this is the first time we're going to hear about something really cool called the Underground Railroad, a way to freedom. Now, this is not underground, and this is not a railroad, but it's called the Underground Railroad. So it's got an odd name, doesn't it? We're going to read about why it was called that in the next few days. Basically, if you were a slave in the South and you wanted to escape up north to freedom, you might, if you were brave enough, try to get on the Underground Railroad. Now, it wasn't underground and it wasn't a railroad. It was called this because it had stations you could get on it. In other words, these stations were people's houses that were wanting to help slaves, abolitionists, even in the South. And those people who would help you along the Underground Railroad, well, they were called well, I forgot what they're called. I'm going to have to read about them here in a minute. They were called, well, we'll find out. But their homes were called stations. They were called conductors. There's the word I'm trying to think of, conductors. And so just like a conductor on a railroad, or a train would help you get to where you want to go, these people would help people get to the next house that was part of the Underground Railroad. And then they would go to the next house that was part of the Underground Railroad. We'll watch a video that tells us more about the Underground Railroad and kind of lets you see how it works. We're going to read and watch a lot about Harriet Tubman, who was maybe the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. We'll read more about her. There was a movie that came out last year just called Harriet. And maybe your parents would let you watch it with them. I don't know if it's appropriate for you to watch by yourself, but if your parents want you to watch it, maybe you can find it on Netflix or something. It's called Harriet, and it's all about her trying to help people get to freedom in the North. Well, let's read this page, and then we'll finish for today. In the early 1800s, abolitionists began setting up a secret network called the Underground Railroad to help slaves escape to freedom in the North. The Underground Railroad was not really a railroad, and it was not really underground either. Underground just means it was hidden from most people. However, it got its name in part because real railroads were increasing throughout the country. As a result, terms used in the Underground Railroad, such as conductor, station master, station, and depot, all came from railroading. Travel by night. Escaped slaves or fugitive slaves traveled mostly at night. They used the moon and the North Star to guide them. During the day, they hid in swamps, forests, or homes of people who wanted to help them. The people who helped enslaved people run away were called conductors. Many had fled to slavery themselves. The most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. She helped more than 300 slaves escape using the Underground Railroad. Conductors led fugitives and gave them instructions to safe places along the way called stations or depots. So the conductors are people helping them go from place to place. And the different places they could hide out at as they try to travel north were called stations or depots. It's like you go to Dollywood and go to the train depot to get on the train. Station masters hid slaves in their homes, barns, and churches. Every person involved in the Underground Railroad risked their own life to help others. It was illegal to help a slave escape. Some runaways traveled as stowaways on boats headed up the Mississippi River. As soon as they crossed the Ohio River into Illinois or Indiana, they were free. Other runaways climbed the rugged Appalachian Mountains to freedom in Pennsylvania. Many runaways ended their journey in Canada. Since Canada was not part of the United States, they felt safe there. If they were caught in the northern state, they risked being returned to their owner. Catching fugitives. The long journey to freedom on the Underground Railroad was extremely dangerous. Sometimes slaveholders sent slave catchers to capture fugitives. If they were caught, severe punishment, including death, awaited them upon return. Sometimes slaveholders sold slaves who tried to run away. Separating enslaved families was among the cruelest punishment for fugitive slaves. So if you look at this map here in our key, we see some general routes of escape. The red arrows, so they would go from down in these southern states up north, maybe into Michigan or over into Canada. A lot of the pathways led into Canada, didn't they? The green are free states. But remember, even if they got up into the green, they could still be caught and returned to the south. The brown are the slave states. Okay? So I want you to watch on the next slide, old Sojourner Truth giving her Ain't I a Woman speech. And then tomorrow we'll do a little more reading about Harriet Tubman and some other of the abolitionists and people working on the Underground Railroad. And then Wednesday we'll watch a video to kind of help you see it and understand it better, okay? All right. Well, thank you for listening today. There are no questions and there's no assignment for today. But thank you for being a good listener, and we'll see you tomorrow.